friends, and welcome back to Professor Strange's Omegaverse class. To quickly recap, Omegaverse is a genre which features this alternative to human biology in which, in addition to being assigned male or female, everyone is also assigned alpha, beta, or omega. Omegas can get pregnant regardless of whether they are male or female. They release pheromones and they go into heats, times in which they have a powerful biological imperative to mate. Omegas are always submissive to the dominant alphas. Alphas are, of course, big and strong and have giant wolf penis. Nothing in Omegaverse is new. It's just a very powerful synthesis of a bunch of fanfiction tropes which existed before. It was created in the year 2010 by a supernatural fandom kink community on LiveJournal, and the original purpose of Omegaverse was indeed wolf pseudoscience-inspired porn. But it's grown a lot since then. It's spread all over fandom, into published romance novels, into Asian fan spaces, and even pop culture. And you can do a lot of really interesting world building with Omegaverse. Are you going to treat it like a fantasy world where pheromones and pair bonding work more like a magic system than biology? Are you going to create a grim dystopia where all of the Omegas are kept in breeding camps? Is it a comedy drama set in the modern world, pointing out the absurdity of heat and mating cycles and Omegaverse's alternative sexual scripts, by contrasting it with also having all of the characters work at Taco Bell? Many readers think that Omegaverse is icky. And, you know, it's okay to think it's icky and to not want to read any of this kind of stuff in your spare time. And it's also perfectly okay to like something that other people think is gross. So whether you enjoy Omegaverse for the erotica, you enjoy it for the world building, or you don't particularly enjoy it at all but are down to learn about its significance, take my hand, friends. Join me once again on an Omegaverse adventure. An accusation that Omegaverse faces very often is that even if it focuses mainly on male-male couples, it's basically just replacing archaic male-female gender roles which often stripped women of agency with shiny new bio-essentialism. But a deep dive into the history of Omegaverse, which I did in my last video, proves that the earliest Omegaverse fanfictions that were ever written were already very aware that you could do interesting things, ultimately subverting those roles and expectations. Dean Winchester is an alpha, no matter what anyone else says, despite the fact that he was born with Omega biology. With his boyfriend, Castiel, a biologically male alpha, Dean has settled into a life that he enjoys and is finally comfortable in his own skin. But when his suppressants fail and he goes into heat, he ends up pregnant with Castiel's child, despite having never wanted the ability to bear a child in the first place. When Jefferson learns that Hamilton, the White House communications director, an infuriating, brilliant Omega, believes he will be forced into retirement after Washington leaves office, it leads him to reconsider the way the world works for Omegas. It leads him to reconsider Hamilton. Dean is a criminal Omega rights activist with the nickname of Robin Hood. Castiel is a runaway Omega going into his second heat with nowhere safe to stay. What happens when their worlds collide? An ill-fated trip to the Omega Clinic marks the beginning of the end of Will Graham's life as an independent Omega. All alphas are collared, tracked, and controlled by the government as part of the Collar Initiative, a set of laws put into place in the 1960s. They temper an alpha's wild nature, protecting Omegas from their more violent counterparts. That is, until the power grid fails one day. Will Graham was an Omega. However, there was something wrong internally. His instinct as an Omega were non-existent due to an imbalance of chemicals in the body, meaning he felt no need to submit to alphas and disliked being ordered around. While his heats were ever present and surely something he dealt with every year, he wasn't considered good enough and wasn't wanted by anyone. Then Hannibal came along. Yes, the plight of the Omega is very often informed by the plight of the uterus haver. Gender-based violence, reproductive rights, medical trauma, these are all things that Omegaverse can address. Omegaverse stories can ask questions like, how is identity informed by biology? Is biology destiny? How does it feel to have a body that is not in your control? Rather than reducing characters to these uncomplicated stock figures of powerful one with penis and dumb stupid one with uterus, gender and sexuality is often even more complicated for the characters of an Omegaverse. However, before I dig you even deeper into the Omegaverse hole, I've got to tell you a little bit about this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. A VPN protects your personal data while you're online by encrypting all of the information that goes between your device and the internet. Another thing that a VPN does is mask your IP address, that way your location and your download history aren't linked to your identity. It is an absolutely essential internet safety tool, especially if you're using any sort of public Wi-Fi. You don't know who's in that grimy public Wi-Fi. Spoiler, it's a very common way that hackers get your information. Surfshark also has their Clean Web feature, which blocks ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts. Another fun perk of being able to change your IP address is that you can access content which might be unavailable or censored in your country. So for example, if you're on holidays right now and you can't access any of your favorite streaming services or websites, Surfshark makes it very easy to switch back to your home country. Surfshark has over 32,000 servers in 100 countries. Maybe there's some really awesome show on German Netflix that you need to check out. Maybe there is. I don't know, maybe there is. Get Surfshark VPN and find out. And Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in trying it out. Go to surfshark.com/eons for an extra 4 months at Surfshark at an unbeatable price. Thank you again to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Remember to click that link in the description down below because you will get an amazing deal if you do so. And now I will return you to your regularly scheduled Omegaverse. Omegaverse is a subgenre of science fiction and fantasy, and like all genre fiction, is a reflective tool. There are many examples of more literary science fiction and fantasy which have reimagined sex and gender. A few articles that I read about Omegaverse mentioned The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin because it incorporates heat cycles into its alternative human biology, but I can think off the top of my head of many other books that incorporate some kind of altered biology and investigate how that would affect sex. Genre fiction has always confronted the absurdity of our own societies and of actual injustices, and expanded our understanding of what is possible by asking, what if it was different? Yeah, it's like super weird, a world where humans have heat cycles, and it's totally unfair that omegas are denied certain jobs just because they're smaller on average and have uteruses. Wouldn't it be like crazy if half of the population bled every month? And there was like a bunch of really common disorders which made this exponentially more painful, but medical professionals don't really tend to care because this subset of the population has always been expected to suffer? What if we laid eggs? Do we lay eggs? I honestly feel like I've been immersed in Omegaverse for almost a month now, and I don't think I know what sex is anymore. Like, I think I need to go read a middle school biology textbook to, like, remember what the normal one is. Omegaverse is absurd. But how much more absurd are we really? But of course, when you read Ursula K. Le Guin, you think, oh, well, of course, it's all thinly veiled feminist theory. This is an obvious exercise in reimagining human biology and society to point out the absurdity of the patriarchal control of our own, of course. That's literature. But not Omegaverse fanfiction. Omegaverse is funny wolf porn written by internet weirdos, and it's probably full of typos anyway, so what kind of literary value could it possibly have? Well, I'm gonna tell ya. Early academic writing focused on fandom tended to come to the conclusions that it was this really interesting and subversive, semi-utopian space. Fandom is a space not gatekept by publishers and their financial interests. There's no trends you're pressured to follow, it's just pure expression. It's not bound by what is normal or acceptable, it makes up its own norms. It's this place where marginalized voices can take control of media and twist it to fulfill their own wishes and reflect their own desires. It's been called modern folklore because of the way these communally told stories grow and change and become this creature that doesn't really feel owned by anyone. I totally agree with that take, by the way. I think it is a modern example of the folklore process, this kind of instinctive storytelling that people do. So fanfiction is just this limitless space for play and fantasy, and interestingly, it is the domain of almost entirely women. The vast majority of writers and readers of fanfiction are women, a demographic that has historically really been excluded from the mainstream media. So they're using fanfiction to fulfill these desires that the mainstream media never will for them. So why is it that they are writing about gay men so often? To explain the most common conclusion that people come to about this, I need to take you back to the first modern media fandom and their most favorite, bestest special boys, Kirk and Spock. Star Trek fandom took off in the 1960s, and yes, this was pre-internet, so fandom looked a bit different. People tended to meet and socialize at conventions, and they circulated their fanfiction in zines. You could get all kinds of Star Trek zines. Some might focus on fanfiction about the show in general. Many of them focused specifically on Kirk and Spock, and then even within that category, you could get Kirk-Spock zines that were perfectly family-friendly, and you could get some that were the raunchiest thing you'd ever read in your life. Something that I just learned, actually, which I will put on screen the paper that I read, which told me this very fun fact, which is that these types of fanzines were actually popularized by earlier science fiction fandom. Science fiction magazines that were filled with short stories were popular starting around the 1920s onwards. I have not from the 1920s, unfortunately, but I have, let's take her out of the plastic. What year is this? I have one from 1968. There used to be a used bookstore in Toronto that I could get these super cheap at. So this is an example of like what a sci-fi magazine looked like in 1968. Will you focus? There we go. I think analog is still going today, by the way. A good number of them are still going today. They're not like the focal point of the science fiction community anymore the way they used to be. But anyway, that was just a fun little crossover with another fixation of mine, so there we go. Fans of these magazines started filling the weeks where there would be no new releases with their own magazines, which included amateur writing and discussion. That's awesome, obviously, that's really cool, but it did tend to be a bit of a boys' club. Not that there weren't totally women science fiction writers, often under male pen names, but Star Trek zines, on the other hand, somehow ended up being like almost entirely and openly the domain of women. In Pornography by Women for Women, with love, Joanna Russ asks, why don't the women who read them and write them simply read romances and be done with it? Why the drag? Why project the whole process onto two male science fiction characters? First of all, Kirk Spock is not about two men. Kirk is a man, to be sure, but Spock isn't. He's a half-human alien. Susan Goober has speculated in recent essays that when women science fiction writers write about aliens, they are very often writing about women. The lovers come from different worlds, these stories constantly emphasize the difference in their natures and backgrounds, and the sexuality in the stories is only nominally male. There are betraying details. The characters leap into anal intercourse with a blithe lack of lubrication that makes it clear the authors are thinking of vaginal penetration. Regarding the type of woman who was drawn to Star Trek fandom, Frances Coppa writes, they were better educated than most, heavy readers, and scientifically literate. Perhaps their involvement in science or in science fiction partially explains some women's great and instant affection for the character of Mr. Spock. Certainly a female engineer, botanist, or computer programmer in the late 1960s knew what it was like to be treated as an alien with an inappropriate and disconcerting emotional range. One of the earliest academic investigations of Kirk Spock / fiction is Romantic Myth, Transcendence, and Star Trek zines by Patricia Fraser Lamb and Diana L. Veith, and this is what they had to say about why women were so interested in this relationship. Kirk Spock stories remove gender as a governing and determining force in the love relationship. The lovers may have problems to confront, but one problem common to contemporary women never arises: one partner's inferior sexual rank in sexist society. Joanna Russ has commented, the what if behind Kirk Spock is, what if I were free? The authors describe Kirk and Spock as psychologically androgynous, and that the absolute most important defining feature of their relationship is their equality. The friendship between Kirk and Spock is obviously very compelling. It's a focal point of the show. They have a great dynamic. Some people have analyzed that to say that their traits, when juxtaposed, equal the perfect genderless dynamic. Spock is very masculine in that he's very logical and controlled in his emotions. He's a scientist. He's also much physically stronger than Kirk because alien reasons. But he's also feminine in that he's very rarely the initiator or the pursuer of romance or sex. He's also a subordinate who is extremely loyal to Kirk and has no desire to command the ship himself. Kirk is obviously masculine in that he is the ship's captain, he is the leader. He's much more confident and promiscuous, but he's also more stereotypically feminine in that he is very emotional and sometimes reckless. He often has to defer to Spock's knowledge and expertise to solve problems, and so they have a great mutual respect for each other. The role of who's in charge and who knows how to solve the problem and who's in peril changes constantly between the two of them, and they're always in it together. Rather than attempt to make Kirk more cautious, Spock's solution is always to accompany his lover into danger, to be there to protect, save, or perish with him. Their adventures are shared. There are no wives, no one stays at home to worry or do the laundry. There are no social expectations for a relationship like theirs. There are no prescribed roles, there's no transactional nature to it, I dropped my phone. Unlike marriage in the mid-20th century is what I was going to say. Now I'll pick up my phone. Kirk and Spock's loving behavior towards one another is behavior many women presumably yearn to share with a man, to receive and reciprocate, for both partners to be capable, independent, for each to contribute a loving strength, and to be loved for strength, not for weakness, for each to be permitted occasionally to be weaker and vulnerable without having to be passive, dominated, or afraid. In an interview in 1981, one very popular Kirk Spock fanfiction writer said, "The problem is women who don't like their own bodies enough, they can't see themselves saving the universe once a week. They can't let their own sexuality out without becoming dependents or victims, so Kirk and Spock do it for them. The sex in Trek fiction, written by women for women, is female sexuality." There you have it. Slash fiction isn't even gay, despite appearances. It's straight women's sexuality through and through. I almost forgot to mention this when I was making notes for this video because it seemed so obvious to me, but slash fiction has never been about reflecting the experiences of actual gay men. In fact, in the early days of slash, many women did not think of the characters they were writing as gay and might even be offended if you suggested such a thing. There we have it. It's nice and clean, squeaky, absolutely squeaky clean. There we go. It's a women's fantasy about finding someone who values them as an equal and just wants to have a fun life with them instead of own their uterus. So Omegaverse completely obliterates that explanation of Slash. I do think all of the writers I just quoted were definitely onto something about the appeal of Kirk and Spock specifically, and I think that their ideas still apply to a lot of modern day Slash, wanting to see an equally competent couple who go on adventures together and no one ever stays home to do the laundry. I still can't think of many straight couples in media who have that dynamic. But put the majority of Slash fiction aside. Put it aside, okay? Looking at Omegaverse specifically, what do we do with that? We have this beautiful shining vision of equality in fantasy gay men making up the majority of couples and fan content. And then suddenly in 2010, a bunch of people go, what if we give some of the men uteruses and then oppress them again? Omegaverse represents women, queer people, other minorities, reintroducing their trauma onto cis male bodies. That's like crazy town, okay? This is why I quote people who are smarter than me. Otherwise I would just stand here and go, guys, this is crazy town. Have you heard about Omegaverse? I put out a post on Tumblr asking for Omegaverse readers and writers to tell me about their experiences with the genre, and a couple people echoed very similar sentiments. I suppose what intrigued me the most about this trope was expressing myself as a female without the characters being female. I know what women go through, and I experienced the horrors of being born with the parts I was given. I mean, being seen as a sex object around the age of 10 can really fuck someone up. As such, I don't partake in media that conveys or exploits this. I don't want to watch or read a show where a woman is stalked, harassed, and raped. I lived through that myself, and I still have to live with being a woman in this world. I started writing fanfics to make my characters explore my trauma when I was too young to understand it myself properly. I suppose I enjoy reading ABO because I'm continuing that exploration without it hitting too close to home. So far, academic engagement with more problematic elements of Slash fiction and fan culture like Omegaverse has been low. It is naturally safer to maintain and perpetuate the myth that women write and read Slash because they seek the egalitarian romance they cannot find in real life. It is certainly far safer than to consider that thousands of women around the globe find sexual relief when writing and reading dark Slash fiction filled with rape, abusive relationships, emotional manipulation, humiliation, non-consensual drug use, forced pregnancy, sexual slavery, bestiality, incest, daddy king, tentacle sex, amputation, suicidal thoughts, and self-harm, among other issues. So why do such a thing? Why create this world where extreme inequality between romantic and sexual partners, alphas and omegas, is a feature of those relationships? Because the implications of such a thing can be pretty dire. If omegas women read uterus havers are just naturally biologically inferior, then what is the point of us having equal rights in society? You want to get an education? What's the point when you're just biologically destined to end up with a man who is superior and in charge and birth his babies and then be financially dependent on him forever if you don't want those babies to starve? Such things reduce humans to the animal level, and that is precisely the scenario that we have in ABO stories. Humans reduced to their base animalistic behaviors and biological urges. Now that is most certainly a predicament we must ask. Does Omegaverse have the capacity to actually subvert our understandings of gender and sexuality? Or is it really just 1950s heteronormativity, but like a billion times worse and more violent? The simple TLDR answer is it is very capable of being both of those things in the hands of different writers. But it's time to unpack exactly how it might do those things. Even if there are parts of this video that might read as like a bit of a defense of Omegaverse, I will admit that not all Omegaverse is equally nuanced or thoughtful. I click on a fic with Omegaverse and it's the most brain-dead surface-level porn-brained piece of crap, I'm gonna get mad. Especially the most extreme Omegas are treated as subhuman, the MC is a sex slave, and is sold to an alpha mafia lord who is literally the devil from the Bible, and there is not an ounce of critical thought or depth behind it. They don't even have to try and dismantle the whole societal structure or anything, just be a bit more nuanced. God handed you the perfect subgenre to write something interesting and you wasted it. It's always buff alpha man rescuing small petite omega girl, and I'm tired of it. Like, no, it's supposed to flip the idea of strong man, weak girl on the head. Make the man pregnant. Let the girl not her husband. Good Omegaverse, or so they call it, is often interested in balancing the power between characters in interesting and complex ways. One way that people might do that is have the petite woman actually be an alpha who knots her husband. Another popular thing is having characters who are like really masculine and domineering in canon actually be omegas in fanfiction to show their more vulnerable side. Stories often use omegas as stand-ins for women in relationships with men to talk about how they might negotiate power in a world where their relationship is unequal. They can show what it looks like to have conversations about consent and negotiate equality in a system that is problematic. This is discussed a bit in a really good paper that I also referenced in my last video, In Between Boys Love and Slash, Dan Fiction, Transcultural Media, and Changing Gender Norms in Contemporary China. That's the paper. So to illustrate this point, the authors summarize the plot of this popular Danmei story, Military Academy Cadets. And allow me to read you the plot summary of that story. The nearly 8,000-word original novel tells the story of Lin Yuan, a brilliant young cadet at the top military academy in the Empire. Having passed the entrance exams with full marks as a beta, he becomes the roommate of a young prince, an alpha named Shiza. Lin Yuan soon captures the heart of the prince with his outstanding physical strength and mental prowess. Later, the prince finds out that Lin Yuan is actually an Omega who has been instructed to use hormone suppressants since childhood so that he could live a free life. This was necessary because according to the law of the Empire, all Omegas must be sent to a special protection center and assigned an alpha mate at the age of 18. They would then be confined to the domestic sphere to fulfill their reproductive duties. One of Lin Yuan's fathers, Ling Yu, is also an Omega who, disguised as a beta, becomes the top general of the Empire. Yet when his true identity is exposed, he loses everything and is forced to live on the run. The father and son together help the prince clamp down on an insurgency led by the head of the military, after which the royal family implements new equal rights legislation, enabling Omegas to participate in public affairs and hold office. A respondent to my Tumblr post drew parallels between Omegaverse dynamics and historical fiction, which I thought was an incredibly interesting point. I tend to like stories set in societies with complex rules and standards for courtships, like Regency romances, and what drew me in was the way Omegaverse societies manage to be queer normative, but still have a lot of patriarchal bullshit, so I can have 2 men or 2 women in an arranged marriage without being forced to spend time addressing the elephant in the room. Which is, of course, that they're gay in a structured courtship situation. Trying to work within convoluted societal restrictions and negotiating power has long been a staple of romance novels. PWP porn without plot is a fanfiction category for a reason. It is a thing. However, porn with plot has long been a lot of women's preference. Yes, there is porn, but sometimes hundreds of thousands of words of context as well. And the intellectual appeal of that plot, of those power negotiations, is often part of the sexual appeal of the story as well. Joanna Russ writes regarding the appeal of these stories, "We have ingeniously, tenaciously, and very creatively sexualized our female situation and training and made out of the restrictions of the patriarchy our own sexual cues. For example, women wait. Women are, quite realistically, wary of heterosexual activity. Thus, the endless analyses of motives and scruples for pages and pages, a delay that is in itself erotically arousing. Women must not initiate sexual activity. Thus, the enormous plot conventions, which finally free the lovers to be sexual, such as going into heat, such as sold to hot alpha daddy scenarios, in which that lack of responsibility is itself exciting, an intensifier of arousal, vulnerability, and emotion made out of a condition." Interesting stuff, Joanna Russ. Good Omegaverse, as they say, can often be about empowerment, about negotiating empowerment within a problematic system. Awesome. But what about the bad stuff? Okay, what about the really bad stuff? What about fics that depict situations that are genuinely really toxic and abusive and sometimes end with the abuser and their victim being in love? The people of Tumblr had to say, "I purposely filter my fanfics on AO3 to avoid it. Maybe my understanding of consent in sex has changed because there's very little of it in the Omegaverse. It's like a very drunken hookup at best. The last time I read an Omegaverse fanfic was in 2021 about the characters of one video game, and it was so disgusting to read when the alpha said he wouldn't let the Omega, who he won in a fight, out of the house until he's off birth control and gets pregnant. I couldn't read any further. It was so gross." Another person said, "I have kind of a fraught and frustrating relationship with the genre. As a woman, I was constantly told that I would have kids, as if pregnancy was the albatross around my neck I could never shake. When I got into fandom and started really exploring my queerness, I tended to gravitate towards ships where no pregnancy was possible, like cis-het men and women dating each other, or one of the characters being unable to conceive for whatever plot reasons. These ships felt like a safe space from the all-encompassing threat of pregnancy. And when I first came across Omegaverse in one of my favorite fandoms, I was shocked and rocked to my core. I don't lie when I say I truly had what I now recognize as a panic attack over it. There are some people who Omegaverse will just never be for. And that is perfectly okay. However, some readers and writers choose to confront similar traumas, similar negative emotions, by inviting those negative emotions in a context where it is safe, in a context such as consuming fiction, where they are always in control, to experience something scary in a safe context, basically. And I think that's not too crazy of a concept. We are a species that willingly eats habanero peppers and watches slasher movies and rides roller coasters. There are lots of people who watch gruesome horror movies and root for people to get stabbed and enjoy it when they do. Are they then going to go out and stab and murder people? Do they think murder is awesome? No. The crazy emotional turmoils and sometimes even outright trauma and abuse seen in some fan fictions, I think can be read as like a safe danger for some people in similar ways. When the Omega Empath Met the Alpha Doctor is a paper about Hannibal Omegaverse, and it talks about this idea of like safe danger a little bit. The author identifies a handful of negative emotions that are very present across a lot of darker Omegaverse stories, such as intense feelings of powerless or helplessness. By default, an Omega is a powerless, sometimes even illegal being, condemned by his biology to a permanent state of helplessness, and also deep feelings of inadequacy and unlovability. By definition, an Omega is not a partner to be loved, but a vessel to continue the Alpha bloodline and fulfill the many sexual needs of his alpha. His pheromone reeking is inconvenient, his constant cycles awkward, his uncontrollable sexual discharge embarrassing. The author suggests that turning these feelings of insecurity into fictional sexual situations is a way of gaining control over them. And let me just say, after reading that paper, Hannibal ABO is bonkers. The paper analyzes one story, which cites Lolita as an inspiration. It's narrated by Hannibal, an adult Hannibal who buys a teenage sex slave Will. It analyzes another story in which Hannibal and Will are both adult alphas. However, Hannibal, who desires Will to be his Omega, gives him hormone replacement without his knowledge or consent to slowly turn him into an Omega, which is honestly not that far from the plot of the original series. So of course Hannibal ABO would be bonkers. A story of intimate partner violence and domestic abuse that no woman would ever want to live in real life becomes a dark sexual fantasy for both author and readers to enjoy only because they are in control of the fiction plot and characters from beginning to end. Another paper about Omegaverse, this time by Milena Popova, analyzes another bad, dark, scary Omegaverse story, a very short porn without plot story entitled Slick, which features non-consensual sex between Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki. Comment exchanges between readers and the author give insight into both the authorial intent and the reader reception of Slick. The story is repeatedly described as both hot and unnerving, horror sex, disturbing, often by the same readers, showing a complex blend of affective, emotional, and intellectual reactions to the story. One reader commented, "This was a wonderful story in so many ways. It was wrong and I just wanted to rescue Jensen." Readers were clearly able to simultaneously derive pleasure from it and critically analyze it. Once again, we discover that just because something is porn, it doesn't mean people aren't using it to also confront complex ideas. The porn versus literature dichotomy is completely fake. You heard it here first on Strange. That's not true. I'm sure people have been saying that for decades. I don't know where you heard it first, but you heard it today on Strange. One Tumblr user said, "I experienced emotional abuse and neglect, including medical neglect, growing up, and have not had a great track record with trying to open up to people in my adult life. A lot of people with CPTSD or similar traumas experience fear or aversion to vulnerability, as well as an intense shame around having needs or desires that they cannot meet on their own. I feel the need to disclaim that I don't consciously read any of the above tropes as wish fulfillment or actively project myself into those scenarios, and I think the fact that the characters are usually male makes it feel safer or more accessible to engage with because it's so distant from my own experiences. In real life, I am an all but stone service top who would sooner fake an orgasm than subject myself to any of the scenarios I have gladly put Dean Winchester through." Another person wrote me a kind of long summary of another darker Omegaverse story that they read, and it is another example of someone, I guess, confronting their trauma through writing Omegaverse. It was a medieval AU of the Omega being a prince to a kingdom that was just invaded and destroyed by another kingdom, and he was forced to marry the alpha guy that literally killed his parents. He fucking hated him, and was also very open about it, but the alpha kept writing it off because Omegas just always love their alpha and are natural mothers, so once we're bonded and have a kid, he'll stop acting so mad, which of course never happened. The stuff that had my jaw on the floor was how the Omega kept on finding any way to abort the baby, which the alpha thought was an impossible thing for him to do, so he never suspected it until a doctor finds out, and he still doesn't believe it. To him, it's simply impossible. This leads to a blowout fight between them, where his worldview gets smashed to pieces because the Omega goes, "Yeah, I was aborting them, and even if you somehow manage to get me to have the baby, I'm killing that fucking thing because I refuse to give you a prince to this evil fucking kingdom. I'm doing that child a favor by making sure it never has you as a dad." This makes the alpha just fucking lost as to what to do because he was truly banking on everything working out for him just because he was an alpha. And he did actually fall for the Omega too, because of his scent and how smart he is. So all of his hopes for them finally getting along and having a family are gone. I adored it, and just how much the Omega was refusing to give him a chance. Because yeah, that fucker literally killed his family and enslaved his people, so why the fuck would he? Seeing the alpha go into despair because bioessentialism couldn't save him from his shitty actions was beautiful. The thing is, I can't read this fic anywhere anymore. It never got an ending. Why? Because the author was a trans man that was using Omegaverse to talk about his fears of corrective rape, and he was harassed constantly. That is to say, harassed by other Tumblr users for writing things that are kind of dark and messed up. Another thing that's really interesting about Omegaverse, another way that Omegaverse potentially subverts our understanding of sex and gender, is its portrayal of non-normative bodies and the way that it breaks taboos. So in the beginning, Slash wasn't even gay, right? By women, for women, etc. But obviously, in the 21st century, we look at Slash and we go, well, that's gay. I know what gay people are. I might even be gay people. I look at that and I know what gay people are and I think, well, that's pretty gay. It's pretty gay. When I personally was being raised in the trenches of Tumblr.com, the gayness of Slash was very much part of the appeal. Screw you, closed-minded parents and teachers and church. I'm gonna make Sherlock and John Watson kiss on the internet. However, shipping two men who look like this definitely seemed really cool and subversive when we were all 13 on Tumblr. It is cool when, like, this is the first time you have ever engaged with queerness in any capacity. However, there is still a lot that bodies that look like this do not challenge. While we eventually figured out that Slash was gay, it was still male, it was still white, cis, able-bodied, etc. The 2000s and 2010s, I would say, very much felt like a time of, well, it's okay to be gay as long as you look normal. You can maybe be gay as long as you're not like one of those weird gross ones, and you and your equally normal partner are like functionally indistinguishable from a straight couple anyway. Except for the fact that you're like the same gender, but the year is 2010, we're past all that bigotry. You can be gay as long as you're normal about it. And I think that perspective is still very much a thing in certain spaces. So something that makes Omegaverse really interesting to me is just how unapologetically abnormal it is. Firstly, in the way that all Omegaverse bodies and desires are non-normative to us, but then you can add this additional layer of what does it look like for bodies to be non-normative within Omegaverse. Tumblr users report, I love knowing that when I get into an Omegaverse fic, the author is usually not going to hold back and unafraid to make people uncomfortable. It's a subcommunity that revels in being weird little freaks, and that's what fandom at its best is, in my opinion. Authors being comfortable with the uncomfortable often makes for more interesting stories plot and character-wise, I've found. Another said, the initial intrigue of Omegaverse, definitely had a lot to do with me being the most repressed Catholic trans mask. Like, haha, imagine a world where someone could be capable of getting pregnant while being a man, and that would be so acceptable. I would then not further think about why that was so fascinating to me for years. I will say, thoughts about Omegaverse from queer and trans people are very, very mixed. I have read a lot of them. Omegaverse has the ability to explore experiences similar to the experiences of trans people without those characters literally being trans, kind of in the same way it is able to do that for women's issues. And some people really like that. You can have a male character who can get pregnant, you can have a female alpha who has a penis, and you don't really need to explain why. That is just a feature of the setting. Whereas some people find that the portrayals of these characters can be really inaccurate and fetishizing. For example, some people, though I do not understand, fetishize pregnancy. And so in that context, the concept of the pregnant man can be especially intriguing because, well, it's so shocking, it's so taboo. Male pregnancy is the ultimate other to both straight couples and gay couples who can't produce children. Yeah, naturally, trans people would like to have some words with you about those sort of attitudes, that sort of fetishizing and othering. One Tumblr user said, unfortunately for my trans mask ass, most of the time it being Omegaverse, features things that make me dysphoric. Male characters get their entire personality and thoughts erased completely a lot of the time and turn into the wanton sex kitten you'd expect in a bad porno's female lead. A lot of the time, it feels very invalidating, as though the man's gender expression and personality don't matter when he's in heat, and he will conform to the stereotypical feminine tropes found in porn just because he has the power to give birth. And that's totally hot and okay with everyone involved. I usually click the back button on those. A number of people also told me that a really big and noticeable trend in Omegaverse fanfiction in the past couple of years is phasing out the ass babies of 2010's Omegaverse, and instead giving male Omegas both sets of genitalia. These days, I believe it is much more common for male Omegas to be described as some form of intersex. The specifics are pretty varied, usually in the realm of hermaphrodism, with any possible combinations of external sex characteristics. The problem with equating this with intersex people is that's almost never what intersex people actually look like or experience. The portrayal of intersex people as possessing perfect sets of both genitalia, or like a slight variation on that, is largely a fetishized fantasy. If we're talking about concepts I'm critical of, the whole intersex omegas/alphas is one of them. I'm intersex myself, and of course, being intersex is a whole spectrum, right? But the way that intersex alphas/omegas work is kind of fetishistic in that it's usually like cis man/woman with both sets of reproductive organs. So Omegaverse has this potential to be really queer and awesome and weird and really validating for queer and trans readers. But it also has the capacity to spread misinformation about these identities. It has the capacity to other trans experiences like male pregnancy, sometimes more than it normalizes them. So that covers Omegaverse genders as like an allegory for real queer and trans experiences. But what happens when we ask the question, what would it look like to be some sort of queer or trans within Omegaverse dynamics? What does it look like to be gender nonconforming in a world with a whole bunch of new genders? What does it look like to be non-binary or asexual? Could a trans woman be an Omega? These are questions that queer writers are tackling with nuance. The fic begins with our protagonist falling in love with his high school sweetheart. His love interest presents as an alpha, and our protagonist is certain he shall present as an Omega, and has created an idealized future of their lives together as the romanticized concept of alpha and Omega. Sadly, the main character then presents as an alpha. The dysphoria he experiences as a result is intense and vividly described, and he feels the need to transition. I found this fic as a bright-eyed teen, and it has not left my mind since, purely because of the ending. The idea that dysphoria could exist around secondary genders and be so painfully accurate to its real-world counterpart, but have absolutely no way of being aided, has stuck with me. There is also a fic I read where the Omega is asexual and therefore struggled with their heat, because while it increases libido and causes them pain, they are sex repulsed, and they need to find ways to deal with those two contrasting desires. The author actually stuck to their guns and didn't try to cure or solve the character's asexuality via them getting railed so good they like it, or meeting the right alpha, which is pretty cool. It's also not uncommon now to see alpha-alpha or omega-omega relationships, which experience like almost a type of homophobia from their societies. I have found that in recent years, there is a lot more quote-unquote non-traditional alpha-omega dynamics, which I think is pretty cool, even if I don't read them often. I like that there's a growing attitude of, I can do what I want with the speculative biology genre, and not feel constrained to a predetermined gender trinary with restrictive boxes. Because yeah, fuck restrictive gender roles in any form. Even if I personally like some particular gender roles in my erotica, I don't think everything should fit that. I've definitely noticed a lot more alpha-alpha fics, which is a little funny to me because what if men had all the same rights as women, and then what if we just still made these two men alphas for the drama? We've looped right back around to gay pining fics, lads. The main character was a beta in love with an alpha, but he talks about how their relationship would never work out because of how their society views relationships that don't result in children. It was very obviously a reference to how real-life society views queer relationships, and probably written by an author whose country is very harsh on LGBT rights. Hearing about all these Omegaverse stories that deal with gender in such weird, I say weird in an endearing way. I love weird stuff. That deal with gender in such a like weird and complex and great way. It almost feels like we've looped back around to this like semi-utopian vision of fandom as this like limitlessly innovative space where people can do anything they want and marginalized voices have power. But unfortunately, I need to like rein it in and poop on the party a little bit again. Fandom may be free from the commercial interests of publishers, and fans may be free from a lot of shame in those settings, which is awesome. But fanfiction writers also were not grown in a lab. Like, they've still spent their entire lives developing biases like everyone else, and there are still issues that plague fandom. Despite all of the potentials of Omegaverse, it is still, most often, a universe in which cis white men experience misogyny and oppression. It's still about characters that look like the typical everyman that has always been the protagonist of media. Some have argued that the potential subversive power of Slash and Omegaverse will always be limited so long as they continue to center white male bodies. Even if they're supposedly stand-ins for marginalized bodies, because is that not a way of just erasing those actual marginalized identities? I think that so far this video has made it clear that that is often the exact appeal for women and queer people writing these stories. They are writing that on purpose to unpack their own issues with a sort of sideways glance. But I do think we hit a wall. We do not find quite as good justifications for Omegaverse when we approach the whiteness of it all. Slash is very, very, very white. And for a long time, it has had the excuse that, well, mainstream media is white. So, of course, these characters that have massive fandoms around them are white. That's not the fault of fans. That's the fault of the mainstream media. But that is slowly changing now. Slowly, but it is changing. As one paper that I read points out, we are starting to see actors who are not white being cast in main roles that fit archetypes that fandom has typically been just love to get their little grimy hands all over. There's the Star Wars boys. There's Marvel characters. Listen, I don't watch that slop. But the slop has very big fandoms. And those fandoms have tended to jump through some hoops to prioritize white characters who have less screen time than the non-white heroes. We have more and more canon texts presenting fans with compelling, shippable non-white characters, and fans are consistently setting them aside or casting them as one-dimensional side characters in their fanfictions. I think part of what appeals to people about fanfiction, fan content in general, is that it's comforting, it's repetitive. People like to read about the same characters over and over again, the same tropes, the same AUs. People just like what they know, especially in fandom, and that does appear to extend to characters who look a certain way. There is a preference for white men afoot in large portions of fandom. Additionally, we sometimes see Omegaverse stories set in like really extreme dystopias where you'll see things like segregation, human trafficking, slavery. These are things that obviously take inspiration from history, from the traumas of non-white people, and then give those traumas to pregnant Jensen Ackles. Maybe there are non-white writers who use Omegaverse to process things in the same way that women and queer people do. I have not read any of those testimonials. I have not come across this hypothetical person. I'm just covering all my bases in case they do exist. I have only heard about these kinds of stories that are very likely written by white writers that just come off a little bit, just come off a little bit HIV living is all. Sometimes Omegaverse stories that try to deal with injustices that have typically been faced by people who do not look like Jensen Ackles, they can be a little bit awkward, just a little bit in bad taste, you know? And I do think that if Omegaverse has a definite limitation on its ability to do interesting social commentary, it's got to be the whiteness. The whiteness of it all. In conclusion, my friends, is Omegaverse good? Is it bad? Sorry, I don't have an answer for you. It can be whatever each individual writer treats it as. Responses to my Tumblr post indicate that the future of Omegaverse is increasingly intellectual, increasingly interested in world building and social commentary. It is increasingly diverse in the queer identities, both literal and allegorical, that it portrays, even though sometimes, and especially in the case of intersex people, it might get it wrong. And there is still not enough women. They all scream from the rooftops, let that woman not her husband. Unfortunately, there are still just not that many women in Omegaverse. The supremacy of the cis white male body in Omegaverse is very intact. But people are making some valiant efforts at dismantling it. And fear not, because even though we've realized that cool world building is awesome and Omegaverse can be intellectual, there is still tons and tons of crazy porn and wolf penis. Somewhere out there, someone is writing crazy wolf penis porn about characters that you love right now. I promise you. Good night.